This episode is sponsored by Kendo UI. Kendo UI allows you to build better apps faster. They have a comprehensive library ranging from data grids and charts to buttons and sliders. Plus, you can use their components as plain JavaScript as well as in Angular, React, and Vue. They have a large collection of customizable popular themes like Bootstrap and Material. Go check them out at javascriptjabber.com/KendoUI. Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of JavaScript Jabber. This week on our panel we have Aimee Knight.
Hello from Nashville.
We have a new co-host, and that's Chris Ferdinandi. Chris, do you want to say hi?
Absolutely. Hey everyone, coming in from Boston.
Now, you haven't been on for a little bit. Do you want to just remind people who you are, and then they can kind of get used to hearing your voice?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am the vanilla JS guy. So I'm going to maybe bring an interesting angle to this. I like working without tools or frameworks, things like that.
I'm excited to have you.
That's why AJ was interested in having you on in the first place, somebody to back him up.
Good to know I have an ally.
I'm super excited to have you too.
Awesome. Thanks, Aimee.
Yeah, you were on in February. I'm just going to throw it out there. And up $2.99. So anyway, we talked about how to learn JavaScript when you're not a developer. And yeah, we talked a bit about vanilla JS and all that stuff. Mm-hmm. We have a special guest this week, and that's Dan Shappir. Dan, do you want to say hi?
Yes, hi. Hi from sunny Tel Aviv. Well, actually, it's night outside right now, but it was definitely sunny all through the day. So, yeah.
There you go. Do you want to remind or let people know who you are?
Yeah, great. So I'm the performance tech lead at Wix, which means that I'm responsible for making sure that Wix sites hosted on the Wix platform load and execute as quickly as possible, which on a good day means that I can come home and say that today I made 100 million websites load and execute faster, which is pretty awesome, I think.
Way to multitask. That's awesome.
Yeah. Every change goes a long way when you've got so many sites hosted on your platform. There
you go. You should make it sound like you go to each one at a time, you know. Today, yeah. Today I specifically made this site, just this one site work faster. Yeah, sometimes I do chat with experts who are using our sites, our service, our platform, and look specifically at their sites and give them suggestions. So sometimes I actually also do that as well. Awesome. Yeah, it's funny because the first time I heard of Wix, my mom mentioned it to me, and I was like, "What is this?" And, you know, it's a hosted site builder basically, and she's like, "Oh, I'm going to use it for my classes." She teaches high school math, so.
Yeah, that's the basic idea, trying to provide everybody out there with the ability to have an online presence. That's basically our mission statement. So, you don't have to be an expert about web technologies. It never hurts, but you don't have to be an expert, and you can still get an awesome website. So yeah. So if she's happy with it, we're happy with it.
Yeah, I think she's pretty happy with it. I don't check in on how she's doing at work all that often, so.
So that's kind of why I thought having you on to talk about performance would be pretty cool, because you have this responsibility of trying to improve performance for a lot of things that you don't have control over and just a ton of different variables. So I thought that would be interesting for people.
Yeah, that's exactly true. I mean, one of the biggest challenges is that in our platform, we try to offer people as much flexibility as possible. Obviously, there are bounds and certain limitations and restrictions at what can be done, but it's actually a very free-form service and platform. So people can do very, very different things with it. And consequently, getting every site built with Wix to become faster is a really big challenge, especially as we continue to add more features and functionality.
So this is really interesting, especially in the sense that when I work on performance, I'm working on an app that I probably built, or at least worked on a significant part of. And so I can kind of go in and go, okay, I know how to make this perform a little bit better. Or, I can generally look at specific things and attack them. You're working on a platform where, who knows what people are doing on there, right? How do you do that?
It's even more difficult than that, because not only do we have millions of users leveraging the platform and doing, almost whatever they want with it. But there are also a lot of developers within Wix who are working and extending the platform. So it's a challenge on both ends because, I don't think anybody at Wix even has a total grasp of all the complexity of the platform that we built. At Wix currently, we have something like around 2,300 people, half out of which are developers. And the majority of developers are actually front-end developers. So we've got hundreds of front-end developers actually working on our products and services and platform. So it's that challenge as well. And, we like to say that each and one of these developers has the keys to the kingdom. They can all push stuff into production. Now, obviously, we've got processes in place to ensure, high quality, doing stuff with TDD and code reviews and whatnot. But still, there's an awful lot going on also in terms of development that's internal to Wix. I think the last time I checked, there was something like a change in production every 2 minutes. That's 24/7.
Wow.
So it's really challenging in this context to make sure that we keep on progressing and avoid regressing when it comes to performance, especially as we add, as I said before, more features and capabilities into the platform. And a lot of that has to do with monitoring performance at various stages, both of development and of production. And that, I guess, is the topic that we'll be talking about today.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to start there, maybe touch on some other things, but I thought it was really interesting. In one of the links you sent over, it was a talk that you did. You talked about how at Wix you consider, because you're able to monitor these things and know when something is getting worse, you actually consider that a bug.
It's even beyond a bug. It can be in the sense that it can literally halt, deployments. If we see regression in performance, before we release a version, that we just won't release it until that regression is fixed. And really, one of the great things for me, at least, is that performance has been specified as a top priority throughout the organization. So I can literally really go to any part of the organization, basically just say, stop, don't push this into production because it regresses performance. And, they want to listen, but they also have to listen. So that's great from my perspective.
Can I step in here real quick? Because we're talking about performance, but what does performance mean? Is it how fast the page loads? Is it how many resources it uses on the front end or back end? Are there other measures that you have that I didn't name in that one or two?
Yeah, well, I really like the rail model, for example, when looking in terms of performance. So, as you correctly said, performance can mean different things in different contexts. For example, when we're looking at user sites, usually the most important aspect currently, it's kind of starting to change, but for now, the most important aspect is still load time. How quickly the page gets in front of the face of the person who's visiting that site. Because, it's been drilled into people that if you build an online store and it doesn't load within a second or two or maybe 3, then you're basically going to be losing your visitors. And so when we're talking about user sites, that's still the most important aspect. However, when we're talking, for example, about our editor, which is the WYSIWYG tool you actually use to build sites, obviously you want it to load also as quickly as possible, but it turns out that there a more important aspect actually has to do with responsiveness, so that when the editor is up and running, when people interact with it, they want it to be really responsive to their interactions. When they grab something, when they click on something, they want it to be, marked instantly and not have a certain delay. Or when they drag stuff around, the dragging has to be really smooth. So, it does change in different contexts. But like I said, for user sites, currently, it's still mostly about load times.
Now, I want to push on that a little bit too, because I talk to different people and they say load time, and what some people mean is the first thing you see on the page, and other people it's after it loads in all of the images, CSS, and executes all the JavaScript. So when you say load time, what do you mean there?
Yeah, that's actually an excellent question, especially again when you look at the complexities of or the variations of different sites that are hosted on Wix, because you're absolutely correct that different people who built sites on our platform, the load time can mean different things for them. If it's really a simple site, then it actually can mean something as simple as when you see the main text or the main image or whatever. On the other hand, if it's an e-com site, then it's how quickly can somebody click the purchase button. Or if it's a site that support booking, how soon can you actually make a booking on that particular site? So you're certainly absolutely correct that the meaning can vary between different sites. I recall one of the, I'm trying to remember who it was that gave this talk. I think it was one of the, the talks at O'Reilly Fluent that I attended. I forget the name of the person who gave it, but he actually said that in many cases, what people consider to be the prime indicator for when a site is loaded is when the hero text and hero image are actually displayed. So it's yeah, it will vary between different people, but so what we primarily try to look at are the more or less standard things. So it's first content, stuff like first contentful paint, and when is the site fully responsive, and also if there are particular features on that site, like let's say I mentioned before e-commerce, when is that functionality actually loaded and active. So we do in fact look at its various factors and at different factors based on site type.
That makes sense. We have our vanilla JS guy here, so I have to ask, what's faster, React or Vue?
To be honest, I'm not entirely sure. I suppose, like all things in life, Chuck, it would depend.
I have to poke you a little bit, but I am curious. Does Wix use any of the front-end framework?
Yeah, so we're really big into React. I think we were actually one of the first big React installations outside of Facebook. We actually transitioned to I joined Wix approximately 4 years. Well, actually, it's almost exactly 4 years ago. And at the time that I joined, we were already in the process of effectively rebuilding our application, our framework using React. So we're really big into React. One of the main motivations actually that we had for going with React was that we wanted to do server-side rendering. At the time, we were 100% client-side rendered. And now we are almost totally server-side rendered, but it only took us almost 4 years.
So I actually have a question about that, Dan. Because I'm familiar with Wix. I used to do some consulting for some nonprofits, and Wix is pretty big in the nonprofit community.
Yes.
One of the things I've noticed on some of the sites I've looked at is if you turn JS off, which is not very common, but I'm thinking hypothetically from like a performance use case. Let's say someone is on a slow network where the JavaScript file times out, or they're at a corporate environment with a really repressive firewall kind of policy that blocks anything that's not on a whitelist. A lot of the sites that I've seen the last time I've looked just don't show anything. Is that still the case, and how does that factor into kind of the performance angle here?
Okay, so we are actually in a sort of in transition in this regard. So as I mentioned before, we were 100% client-side rendered, and that was the case until more or less the middle of last year. And since then, we deployed server-side rendering in the middle of last year, initially just to mobile clients, and now it's for 100% of the client devices. So up until the middle of last year, you would have been absolutely correct in that because it was wholly client-side rendered using client-side JavaScript, then without JavaScript, you basically got no visible client for the end user.
Sure. And to be fair, that's probably the last time I looked too. It's been a while since I've looked around.
We are currently, as I mentioned, 100% server-side rendered, or almost 100%. There are still certain cases in which it isn't, but it's almost 100%. But we are still using JavaScript for some layouting. So if you disable JavaScript right now, even though it's server-side rendered and even though you get the full HTML, you might still get a blank site because we're not properly layouting the site. And like I said, we're still using JavaScript for that. We actually also have another project going on right now, which is about trying to go as fully CSS and as little JavaScript for layouting as possible. So then you would actually get a visible site, even though JavaScript is disabled. Now, what you might be able to do with that site might be very limited because, like I said, if it's an e-com site, probably all that e-com functionality won't work. So you'll probably so within a few months, every Wix site that you would go to would be visible to at least to some extent, even if JavaScript is disabled. How functional it would be, depends.
I would imagine, I just want to add really quick. So if you're switching from JavaScript to CSS for layout, because you can now use grid, that's going to, not only will it work without JavaScript, but it's going to be a lot faster because the browsers are now, they've re-architected things in a way where it's going to be more performant to use CSS for something like that than JavaScript.
Oh, for sure. There's another advantage as well. Because we don't want to see things like move around the screen or let's put it differently, we don't want things to be displayed incorrectly before they're properly laid out. Which means that in many cases, we actually hide the content while it's downloading and then use the JavaScript to properly lay it out and then make it visible. With CSS layout, you can have it visible from the get-go, which means that as the HTML is arriving at the client, it's that portion of the HTML is immediately visible and the user gets to see things sooner. And then obviously, as you stated, also the layouting itself is done faster because it's GPU accelerated and whatnot.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So Dan, one of the things I was really excited about when I saw the invite for this one come through is the Web Performance API, which I think was, kind of the high level topic here. Is that something you guys are using internally to measure performance of the Wix sites? And if so, can you talk a little bit about that?
Definitely, for sure. So yeah, I'd just like to mention that the information, I really got into this API. I think it's an awesome API. I like it so much, in fact, that when O'Reilly Fluent came around, I actually suggested initially just to do a talk about that. And then they came back and said, hey, why don't you do a workshop instead? And initially I thought, well, do I really have enough content for a workshop? And by the time that the workshop came around, I actually had to start cutting stuff out because it turned out that there was just so much stuff to talk about. Because this is a big API, but it's a really awesome and very useful API. And we definitely use it internally at different stages of the process in order to ensure, as I mentioned before, that we're not regressing in terms of performance and in fact that we are progressing. Because my experience with performance has always been that unless you're progressing, you're almost by definition regressing. It's never stationary. You're either moving forward or you're moving back. We are using the Web Performance API to actually monitor performance at 3 different stages, you can say. The first stage is basically the development stage. It turns out that the Web Performance API actually integrates really well with tools like the Chrome Dev Console, for example. So it's a really excellent tool to use while you're actually working on your application. And you can use it during the development process to measure the impact of various changes that you're making. And you can actually see it really well, visually, in a very good way within the Chrome DevTools. Right at the other end of the spectrum, you can use it in production. we actually monitor, collect information from user sessions. It's all anonymous, but it's performance-related information that we collect from active sessions, and we've got hundreds of millions of them going on all the time. We collect all this information, and that gives us a really good understanding about how our applications are actually behaving, when real users are using them out in the field. And it turns out that we can also use these APIs in a sort of let's call it a middle or central phase, pre-production during testing. So we can actually have automated tools that check the performance of various specific use cases. And then if we see a regression during these automated tests, we can actually say, okay, I'm not going to push this version into production. So it's really beneficial to use these APIs at all these stages of the development process.
Awesome. Sorry, I was on mute. So for folks who don't know what the performance API is, because I've only heard about it recently, actually. I think that gentleman from Netflix may have given about some changes they made to their JavaScript approach. Can you talk a little bit more about what that is, how it works? Maybe just step back a bit, because I think this is an API that a lot of folks just aren't familiar with.
Yeah, for sure. So there's actually a working group within the W3C called the Web Performance Working Group. The co-chairs are Ilya Grigoric, I think, from Google, and Todd, I can't pronounce his last name, from Microsoft. And they've been working for a while now on actually exposing a lot of the information that, if you think about it, is really available within the browser out to JavaScript running on the browser. So, for example, when the browser downloads a certain resource, it might be a JavaScript file, it might be an image or an HTML, whatever, or font, whatever, it actually can very easily measure the various stages of downloading that resource. You might have DNS lookup, and then that would be followed by a TCP handshake and the SSL handshake, and then you send the request to the web server, and then you get the beginning of the response going all the way to the end of the response, and so forth. So you've got all these various stages of, let's say, downloading a resource. And as I said, the browser can easily measure each and every one of these stages and then basically expose them to you. So the basic idea behind the Web Performance API is basically for the browser to expose all this performance-related information that it's collecting, and to expose this information in a way that's coherent and uniform. It essentially maintains a sort of an internal buffer where it places performance entries sequentially. So, if something happens before something else, if downloading file A happens before downloading file B, then that will be their sequence within that buffer. And then you can go and inspect the various entries within the buffer and basically just see the impact that these events had on overall performance. So, for example, the first entry within the buffer would naturally be downloading the HTML file itself for that web page or website. Now, the HTML actually starts downloading before any part of your code gets to run. So in the past, you basically had no insight about things that happened before your JavaScript actually arrived. Once your JavaScript got there, you could start measuring things yourself. But before your JavaScript even got there, you basically had no insight into the things that happened then. So now you can actually have access to all these timing information about downloading the HTML that happened before your JavaScript was downloaded. So as I mentioned, you can basically check, let's say, the DNS time for your site. I don't know how many organizations out there are actually verifying that they're getting acceptable performance from their DNS all over the globe. And we definitely do actually measure that. It was actually an interesting thing because I think in 2016, if you guys happen to recall, there was this cyber attack on the Dyn DNS provider, which basically shut down half the internet. And we could actually see that in the DNS graphs, the DNS performance graphs that we had running based on this performance information that we were collecting. So this and basically, this gave us sort of a heads up and the ability to react to something like that sooner than we might have otherwise responded to it. So, I can go on and talk about this forever. So if you have any question or you want to ask me anything, just make sure to interrupt me. So as I mentioned, you've got this internal buffer of entries. You've got an entry for the navigation to the web page itself. You've got additional entries for every additional resource that you download, for example. You've got entries for paint events, and so on and so forth. And then you can basically go and do a query of these entries and basically get back an array of entries that match your query. So, for example, you could ask, give me the entries for the paint events, or give me the entries for all the resources. And then from these resources, filter out just the fonts that you downloaded. And that way you can actually know how long it took to download the fonts, the overall size of all the fonts. Now, going back to our initial discussion about the fact that our pages are so malleable and the users can change them, when you're building maybe a specific site, then you can at least initially say, okay, I know exactly which fonts I'm going to be using in my page, and I can calculate in advance their total size, and I know what their impact is going to be. In our case, where users can literally pick whichever font they want, that's something that I want to monitor. If I start saying that fonts have too great impact on the performance of Wix sites, we can start thinking about what to do about it. Maybe we should switch to a CDN provider. Maybe we should encourage people to use fewer fonts within the same page. Maybe we can use resource hints to start loading certain fonts earlier. There's a lot of ways in which we can respond to something like that once we are aware of it. But even if you are building your own site and you think you have total control, at the end of the day, somebody else within your team or somebody who's in charge of the content for your site or a designer can play with your site, add some text, and all of a sudden you're downloading 7 additional fonts that you haven't considered. And these things can have a really significant impact in terms of size. And if, for example, that person didn't specify a fallback font, then what would happen is that until all these fonts are downloaded, then the visitor to the site might not actually be seeing any text at all. So the site is rendered, the text is there, but nobody's seeing anything because the font hasn't downloaded yet. So that's one interesting example of that.
This episode is sponsored by Sentry.io. Recently, I came across a great tool for tracking and monitoring problems in my apps. Then I asked them if they wanted to sponsor the show and allow me to share my experience with you. Sentry provides a terrific interface for keeping track of what's going on with my app. It also tracks releases so I can tell if what I deployed makes things better or worse. They give full stack traces and as much information as possible about the situation when the error occurred to help you track down the errors. Plus, one thing I love, you can customize the context provided by Sentry. So, if you're looking for specific information about the request, you can provide it. It automatically scrubs passwords and secure information, and you can customize the scrubbing as well. Finally, it has a user feedback system built in that you can use to get information from your users. Oh, and I also love that they support open source to the point where they actually open sourced Sentry if you want to self-host it. Use the code DevChat at Sentry.io to get 2 months free on Sentry's small plan. That's code DevChat at Sentry.io.
So a lot of what you've described seems like stuff that I can already access today via, say, like developer tools, looking at like the network tab or something like this. Do those two... So is that tab using this API behind the scenes? Do you get any benefit from kind of tying into the JavaScript API versus just opening up DevTools and looking at your portal? Like why would I prefer the API over something visual, just hypothetically?
So as you recall, I mentioned that we actually do performance measurements at 3 different stages. So the development stage, you're absolutely correct that a lot of this information is also made available to you visually through the development tools. But we also want to use this information during automated pre-release tests, and we also want to use this information in production by actually collecting these information from real user sessions and then sending them back to our telemetry servers, and then we can graph them and do all sorts of analysis on them. So first of all, these APIs do provide you the ability to access this information in other stages apart from the actual development process. But what I found is that often this information is also very, very useful during the development, even when I am working with the dev console. Say, for example, I'll give you just, a really simple example. Say you've just got a link from somebody or let's say you just open your site without DevTools open, and then it loaded very slowly for some reason. Now, you're not sure that if you now open the DevTools and go to the network tab and reload, you're not sure that this behavior will actually reproduce. So with this, you can actually open the DevTools, go to the console, and enter a very simple JavaScript instruction in the dev console and get back timing information for the resources that have already been downloaded while DevTools was actually closed. So that's one example of where it could be useful even with the presence of DevTools. Another thing, though, is that there's also as a part of the Web Performance API, there's actually something called the User Timing API, which basically lets you as a developer insert custom events into that internal buffer of events. So in addition to the events that are automatically generated by the browser itself, as I mentioned, for when downloading resources, when performing painting, something like that, you can also inject your own events. So if you've got, let's say, some sort of a lengthy computational operation that's potentially asynchronous, so it's happening in stages, you can put a marker at the beginning. Actually, you can do that via a command called, quite literally, performance.mark. So you can put a marker at the beginning of this logical operation, put another marker at the end of this logical operation, and then you do some performance.measure, providing the name of the marker at the beginning and the name of the marker at the end. What's really cool about that is that then if you go into the performance tab in the dev console in Chrome, you will actually see those markers. There's a central region there in that DevTools called, I think it's user timings, and you will actually see them there. So you can actually go and check and see and correlate your logical operations to network operations that were happening at the time or to JavaScript operations that were happening at that time. Even, as I said, even if this operation was asynchronous and composed of various stages, a bit of JavaScript, some network, more JavaScript, more network, and so forth. So what I found is that this combination of using the Web Performance API in conjunction with the DevTools actually made both of them more powerful than they would either, each would be independently or separately from the other.
I wanted to go back. You touched on it for a second a minute ago when you were talking about resource hints, because I don't think everyone is familiar with what this is. And I know in your talk, like there's a million different combinations. But can you maybe spend 2 or 3 minutes talking about how you guys are using these? And are there some that people can easily add that are going to give them like a big bang for their buck?
Yeah. So Yeah, resource hints are a topic, I think, for potentially a whole show that you guys might want to do eventually. They're awesome. I really like them. I think they're a great addition, and we use them significantly. Basically, a resource hint is a mechanism where you can tell the browser something like, I'm going to need a resource, and you can start downloading it now if it doesn't really interfere with other stuff that you're doing. And then when you actually do need it, then it will already be there. And then you will be able to use it immediately without having to wait for the download. So a great example of that, again, going back to the fonts, I see that I'm talking about fonts a lot today. Up till recently, it's really been up to the browser to decide when it's going to be to download fonts. You would, you could specify the font families in the CSS, and you would then assign, those fonts to text. But until that text was rendered, the font wouldn't actually download. Actually, what would happen was that when the text was rendered, then the browser would see that it actually needs a certain font, and then it would download that font. And as I mentioned before, if there was no fallback font until that font was downloaded, you actually didn't see anything. If maybe there was a fallback font, but then you would see the text in one font, and then it would switch to the other, which would be visible, kind of jarring potentially. So with resource hints, you can actually give a link tag, and the rel is, let's say, set to preload. And then you actually give the URL to that font file, and the browser would just download that font file, potentially at a lower priority, and then essentially either just store it in the local cache. And then when it actually does need that resource, hey, it's in the cache, and I can use it immediately. So there's preload, which essentially tells the browser, look, I know that I'm going to be using this resource in this page later on. Download it now because it's beneficial for me that you do that. And there's prefetch, which is kind of similar, which says, I'm going to need this resource, but not in this page, but rather in a future page. So I don't want you to impact the performance of the current page, but if you manage to find some idle time, then it would be great if you start downloading that resource, really low priority. I don't mind if it happens at a slower rate, but it would still be great if by the time that I actually need it, it's there. There's also another option, which is pre-connect. When I talked before about the various stages when you download an HTML file, I mentioned that initially you need to do the DNS lookup, then the TCP, setting up the TCP connection, then doing the SSL handshake. Well, pre-connect basically says, look, I know that I'm going to be downloading some resource from this domain. I just don't know which resource yet. So do all this do all these steps of setting up the connection, but just keep that connection open without actually trying to download anything over that connection. And then when you actually do need that connection, hey, it's up and running and you can use it instantly without having to do all this negotiation. And you'd be surprised at how long these steps can actually take. I mean, DNS, can take a really long time. You might hit a DNS server and doesn't know the answer, and it kind of propagates out, and that can take a while. Likewise, if you're maybe setting up a transatlantic connection, the TCP connection, and the SSL handshake, those can take hundreds of milliseconds. So yeah, if you can save that time by doing it sooner, that can be a really big benefit. And there are others as well. It's just like I said, it's a huge topic, and this is really supported by most browsers now. And those that don't support it, well, you just didn't get any benefit, but it's not, it's not causing and doing any harm. So it's a really great thing to use. And I've seen a lot of companies talking about, the improvements that they got from using resource hints in a proper way. Now, obviously, you do need to exercise some care, because if you're downloading a certain resource, it's potentially in contention with other resources that you're downloading, because at the end of the day, bandwidth is limited and so forth. So if you're downloading a certain resource before you actually need it, make sure that you're not accidentally blocking, let's say, other resources that you do need right now. So you do need to exercise some care, but overall, it's a really great addition to your arsenal in terms of performance.
Awesome. Sounds like a lot of things to play with. I know I've dug into this a little bit when I was doing like research for my CSS talk because of CSS being render blocking. But the other question I wanted to ask you, I feel like most people are bundling, but you actually talked about there being some trade-offs there. So can you discuss that?
Yeah, for sure. So one of the things that we try to do, especially given that we're still dependent, as we talked about before, on the JavaScript that we download, currently still for certain aspects of visibility and certainly for interactivity, we need to download JavaScript content to the client side. And as has been shown often, JavaScript is one of the most impactful resources that you need to download. So you really want to be as smart as possible about that. And what makes it even more challenging is that the network protocols are changing, and this also has impact on, for example, let's say downloading JavaScript. I mean, up to a few years ago, all of us were using HTTP 1.1, which basically said that we could only download one resource at a time over a connection. Now, what most browsers did was open up 6 sockets to a server and just keep those sockets open. So you basically could download 6 resources in parallel. Well, now we are in the process of transitioning to HTTP 2, and all of a sudden it supports multiplexing. So now you can download theoretically an unlimited number of resources from the same server in parallel. So that all of a sudden changes the game because, So what we've found is that on the one hand, you want to strive to bundle resources together because, for example, it makes gzip more effective. If you have, let's say, 2 smaller JavaScript files and you bundle them into a single JavaScript file, then compression for that single file is going to be much more effective because compression is basically built on repeated patterns. So you basically leverage the patterns from the first file into the content of the second file. Whereas if it's 2 separate files, then you kind of like as if starting from scratch. So compression is much less effective. So here's a big advantage of bundling together. But when you're bundling together with JavaScript, you're not actually starting to parse and certainly not to run that JavaScript until that entire file is downloaded. In this regard, JavaScript is very different from HTML. HTML, you can start parsing it and actually rendering it as it's downloading. That you can't do that with JavaScript. So if you have like a huge JavaScript file, then until that JavaScript file finishes downloading, you're just waiting for it to arrive. Whereas if you've broken that JavaScript file into, let's say, 2 or 3 separate chunk files, then if the first one arrives while the other 2, let's say, are still downloading, you can already parse that file, maybe even start executing that file. So it's kind of a trade-off between that. So on the one hand, you want your files to be large enough to get the benefit of compression, but on the other hand, you want them to be like small enough so that you can start parsing and executing in parallel while other stuff is downloading. I hope that makes sense.
Yep, it does.
In that regard, by the way, the performance tab in Chrome DevTools is really great because you can actually see both the download, the network, and the JavaScript execution. It's a really busy kind of a tab, really, heavy display. And I know that a lot of developers are kind of wary of that tab because it contains so much information. But in this context, it's really, really useful because you can ensure that you're kind of getting the optimal combination of download times and script parsing and execution. And we've definitely invested in that. And again, that's something that all the profiling that we're doing with the Web Performance API is helping us, because we can make sure that we're counting how many JavaScript files we're downloading, what's the total size of the JavaScript files, when did we start downloading them, when did the last one finish downloading, and we can take all these into account and compare them and correlate them to when rendering started to happen and so forth.
So one question that I have two questions actually, and I'll try and make them really quick. The first one is you mentioned that you gather the information from the Web Performance API and you put it all into some system. What system is that?
Okay. So I actually have a presentation of that, but I'm not the expert in the company of that. So hopefully I'll try not to give misleading information. Mm-hmm. Actually, let me try to phrase it somewhat differently. There are a lot of tools, third-party tools out there that you can actually use and leverage for monitoring performance within your website. And anybody who's building a website, especially those that are building them for commercial reasons, purposes, I highly recommend that you use some performance monitoring solution. I'm not going to advertise any one of them, but there are plenty of them out there. Now, we had been using some of them. At the end of the day, we ended up rolling out our own infrastructure in this regard. Mm-hmm. There were a couple of reasons for that. One reason is that our use case is kind of different from most. I remember at one of the conferences talking with one of the vendors, and he was extolling the virtues of their solution. And I said, this sounds great, but are you aware that we actually manage 3.5 million different domains? And he kind of that caused him to kind of pause. And he said, well, maybe our tool isn't really right for you. Now, obviously, that's not going to be the case for most people. So one of the reasons that we had to roll our own solution was the fact that our scale was different than what you generally encounter out there. Another reason is that a lot of these tools actually charge based on the amount of data that you actually push into them, or the size of the queries that you run on them. And we were just putting out so much information that cost-wise, it actually made sense for us to have our own people managing this infrastructure rather than paying a third-party provider. But certainly if you're a medium-sized company, or certainly a smaller-sized company or startup, and you've got one, maybe two sites, then it makes a whole lot of sense to use a third-party solution that's probably built and uses the Web Performance API internally. So it's built on top of that, and you not necessarily need to be aware of it. One thing that I would say is that when you look at a third-party solution, that you make sure that it's extensible. That means that you can actually push in like custom events that are relevant for your product. Because, for example, a lot of these tools used to just look at really standard events like DOM ready or page load, and these are not really that relevant anymore in this day of age of single page applications. So you do want to be able to like kind of signal into that tool, telling the tool, okay, this is the time that I'm interested in the context of my specific application. So you want to make sure that whatever tool you do pick does provide APIs for doing that. Or alternatively, as I said, you can roll your own. Basically, let me open this up. I actually have another presentation here. I think I actually sent you guys the link to a talk I did where I was talking about all the systems we were using on the back end. We're using Hadoop, for example. We're using Nginx. We are running things through, we are using Grafana. We're using Quix. We're using a whole bunch of things. We've got a large number of business analysts, data analysts, and data scientists that are actually busy crunching all these numbers. So I need to make sure that I'm providing them with the relevant information, and then they can do interesting stuff with it. You know what? I'll give you an interesting example that I don't know how many third-party tools are actually considering that. Maybe I'm throwing a tip to these tools. It turns out that with modern browsers, they actually tell you what caused the page to load, whether the load was a result of just a regular navigation or a reload or clicking the back button, for example. That's actually part of the information that's exposed to you by the Web Performance API. And if you think about it, if, for example, you might measure the ratio of the total loads of your page versus loads caused by a user performing a reload, because it might be an indication that there's a problem with your system if users are reloading your page too often. Maybe your page is loading too slowly and it's like, clicking the elevator button. Or maybe it's loading incorrectly and they're pressing reload because they are hoping that whatever they're saying will correct itself if they load it again. So kind of displaying the ratio between regular loads and reloads can provide potentially useful information. And that's an example of something that you can get out of the Web Performance API.
Interesting. Now I'm going to let Aimee do her picks really quick, and then I have one more question that, in fact, I'll just throw the question at you real quick right now. You can think about your answer while Aimee does her picks. But essentially it's, okay, you've gathered all this information. What do you do once you have it? Like, what do you look for, and what patterns do you generally see, and how do you decide what to do next to optimize things? But Aimee, go ahead and do your picks.
Thanks. Yeah, it was awesome to talk to you, Dan. Sorry, I got to run. But I'm going to get kicked out, and I have a meeting that I have to go to in 3 minutes. But my picks, we were talking at the beginning of the show, and I think I tweeted something about how early I wake up, and people were kind of shocked. But yeah, I usually wake up between 3:45 and 4 a.m. I do go to bed pretty early because of that. So one of my picks is just going to be, I don't know, if you think that might be, if you're a moderate morning person, I might encourage you to try waking up like super early if you think you might like it, just because the people that I do know that wake up that early, I mean, the gym is actually, there's a good number of people in there when I get in there at like 4:30, and you're just able to be super productive because a lot of people are not emailing yet. People aren't texting me yet. There's not a lot of traffic on the road. If I need to run to the store really quick and do an errand, there's nobody there yet. So it enables me to just be super productive and super focused. So usually what I'll do in the mornings is in between my sets, I'll answer emails from the night before or catch up on stuff that's going on Twitter and stuff like that. It just enables me to really, really, really be like hyper focused at that hour and not have any distractions. So that's going to be my first pick. And then my second pick, this was something that came up on Hacker News like a couple weeks ago, but I thought it was pretty good, just how to deal with dirty side effects in your pure functional JavaScript. So it starts off, I think I would recommend this to people who are kind of just getting started with functional programming. It starts off with some pretty basic concepts that you can borrow, but then it does get a little bit more advanced. So depending on how much experience you have, your mileage may vary. I'd encourage you to like finish it because it's pretty good. But that is it for me.
Awesome.
Cool. And it's coming to me that I potentially may have picked that recently. So if I did, I apologize.
It was so good you got it twice, folks.
It really is that good, though. I think you should read it. So, but they didn't get my morning pick. So cool. Nice. Okay. See you guys next week.
Bye, Aimee.
Bye.
Bye.
All right. So back to that question, Dan. If people have gathered information about the performance of their web application, what should they be looking for and how should they react to it?
Okay, so from my experience, we're actually using this data we're gathering in three main ways. First, an obvious way is to generate alerts. Nobody can expect you to be sitting in front of the graphs all day. So you really want to have a good alerting system, and a good alerting system is a system that doesn't have too many false positives on the one hand, but that you don't miss the real important situations. So again, going back to how I mentioned about picking a good third-party solution for your monitoring, one of the things that you need to make sure is that they do have a good alerting mechanism built in, and that whatever system you use for getting your alerts, maybe it's emails, maybe it's Slack, I don't know, maybe you're getting texts, whatever, that system does in fact support it. So that's one important use for this information that we're gathering. Another is to see trends over long periods of time. I need to present to management in the company every quarter, like sort of how performance changed over that period of time. So I want to be able to show a graph that basically highlights the KPIs that we are most interested in and how they change over time throughout that quarter or maybe throughout that year. So you definitely want to be able to do that and have a system that does that. And kind of in between, we're also looking at various real-time graphs because, for example, one advantage that front-end developers have over back-end developers is that usually things break when we deploy them. One of the advantages of being a front-end developer over back-end developers is that the likelihood of being woken up in the middle of the night is kind of lower. So we might be looking at the graphs, at the real-time graph during the couple of hours after we deployed the new version. And again, over time, we've learned to identify those KPIs that were really interesting for us, and we made sure that we calculated them and displayed them in the most actionable way. And in this regard, you may find that whatever you've decided to measure and graph and display and alert on might be different than whatever somebody else is looking at.
Gotcha. All right, well, let's go ahead and do some picks. Is your job search stuck? Maybe you're not getting any interviews with employers, or maybe you are, but no job offers. Or you may be new and not even know where to start. This is Charles Max Wood, and I'm releasing a new course and ebook on how to find a job as a software developer. The course walks you through the process of finding the types of companies you want to work for, getting their attention, and putting your best foot forward as the candidate they want. I've coached dozens of developers in looking for jobs and have been able to help several people find jobs within 2 weeks to 2 months. So whether you're new to development, can't find a great job that fits what you want, or are looking for remote work from an area without a strong tech community, I can help. Go to getacoderjob.com and sign up today. Chris, do you want to start us off with picks?
Yeah, absolutely. So for me this week, I actually just discovered this really awesome dependency-free library or vanilla.js library, if you prefer, plugin, what have you, for off-canvas navigation. So great for slide-in, slide-out menus and things like that. It's called Offside by Too Much Design, which is up on GitHub. Really helped me out, saved me a ton of hours on a project I was working on recently. So that was pretty cool. The other thing, I am fully immersed in season 3 of Insecure on HBO. So if you enjoyed the first 2 seasons, I would super recommend it. If you missed the first 2 seasons, it's an awesome show. It doesn't fall off in the second season like some other HBO shows have. So I would highly recommend it.
Awesome. I'm going to jump in with some picks here. One pick that I have a love-hate relationship with my iPhone because I get addicted to these stupid games. The one that I've been playing lately is called Terra Genesis. I picked it up, I'll admit, on Saturday. And so far, I've already terraformed Mars, and I am now working on terraforming Venus. So Anyway, it's kind of an interesting game. There's a lot of waiting that you wind up doing, for processes to complete and credits to build up and things like that. But anyway, it's been pretty fun to try and kind of get all of these different aspects to balance so that, in theory, at least, people could live on different planets. You start out in our solar system and you can buy all kinds of other stuff or all kinds of other planets to go and terraform. So, for example, Mars is different from Venus in the sense that on Mars, you basically have to build up all of the atmosphere and oxygen and everything. And on Venus, you actually have to dissipate some, or, the atmospheric pressure is too high. And so you have to bring it down, and the surface temperature of the planet is way too high. So you have to bring that down and then build up the oxygen from scratch and the water from scratch. Anyway, so it's kind of interesting just playing that game.
Yeah, it's if I may comment, it's funny, I'm not so much into games. I'm not a big gamer, but if there's like one type of game that I do enjoy is those strategy build them type of games. And it's kind of funny because I actually at a certain stage in my career actually worked at creating games. So it's funny that while I don't enjoy playing games that much, I actually enjoy programming games, which I guess is why I'm in software development.
Nice. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, we all have our thing, right? And yeah, in some ways, building software is kind of like a game. Is it going to work? Are people going to want it? So anyway, two other things that I'm going to bring up really quickly. One is, so I've been listening to this book on my iPhone. I kind of go back and forth between listening to podcasts a lot, listening to ebooks a lot, or audiobooks a lot. The book I'm listening to right now is The One Thing. And I've really been enjoying that. And the question is essentially, what is the one thing that would make everything else easier or make it not necessary anymore? And work on that. And that really got me to focus on a lot of things. And one of the major things that they tell you to do in the book is to work 4 hours a day on those things. And it's kind of aimed, I guess, a little bit more at entrepreneurs. But as developers, again, it's the same kind of thing, right? What kinds of things are going to make things easier or make things unnecessary? So, for example, writing tests, or, we talked a whole bunch about performance, and maybe that's your one thing that's going to make the difference for your customers and your audiences and things like that. So, anyway, it's kind of interesting just to dig into that. But for me, it made me realize that my one thing really has to be making all of the podcasting processes done. And I've kind of been doing that in my spare time. And now I'm going to be doing that like half time, because it's 4 hours a day. So anyway, that's kind of been the focus. And then what the thing that's nice about that is once I have those processes down, I've been working on some software to help manage the podcasting processes. So then my next one thing may be that, right? So now I have all the processes. I know how it's all supposed to work, and then I can work on that. So, maybe your one thing is setting up your deployment processes or setting something up to collect all this information or anything like that. So anyway, really, really enjoying that. And then I have two announcements, things that I have either released, in the process of releasing, or I'm working on. One is I'm working on getting more content on my YouTube channel. So I've started a show, since this will release in the future, and I'm going to record them this afternoon. I'm going to be releasing a show called JavaScript Rants, and I'm just going to go look for information out there on JavaScript. At least one per week. It's going to be kind of on things that I'm thinking about or working on these days. So you're probably going to get a lot of like career advice over the next few weeks, because I'm working on a book on how to find a job. But then whatever. The other thing that I'm working on, and I just set up a Kickstarter for it. I don't know if the Kickstarter is public yet or not, but it will be by the time this goes live. And it's for Code Badge. So codebadge.org. I've decided that I have people ask me how to stay current, and I don't want to just put something out there that says, hey, do all this stuff and you're current. So instead, what I thought was, well, what if people went out and they went through the process of learning a technology and then they somehow earned a badge for it? And so I'm formulating that. And so then if you come in and you're saying, I want to learn Webpack, or I want to learn, one of the performance monitoring tools or something like that, there'll be a process for learning that stuff and then maybe applying some of the stuff that you learned. And once you've done all that, then you can put links into where you did that stuff. So, if you set up, one of these monitoring tools, you can put a link into where you set it up, or, your GitHub repo with all your configs in it or something. And then it'll show you all that stuff. Anyway, I'm going to do a Kickstarter on it. And then I guess if it doesn't get Kickstarted, then I'll gee whiz whatever it. And if it does get Kickstarted, then I'll probably have some people come in and help me build it. But anyway, and I'm probably, at least initially, going to be doing some YouTube videos on how I'm building that as well. I'm doing it with Elixir and Vue.js. So anyway, just throwing that out there. Dan, what are your picks?
So I have 2 picks for you. The first is actually Wix Engineering has this really nice site that has a blog where various engineers at Wix write, I think, really interesting blog posts and also videos from when we go to various conferences. So there's this site, and there's a lot of really interesting content there, both for front end and for back end. So that's one link that I would like to put out there. The other is that you were kind of talking about how to make learning and achieving fun. Well, one of the ways that I really like to do that sort of a thing is to come up with riddles. So I've actually on my Twitter, I've actually been posting like every couple of weeks, sometimes it's a bit more, sometimes less, JavaScript riddles. And I've collected quite a number. I think there are a couple of dozens out there. So I'm actually going to put a link that's like to that Twitter hashtag that will bring up all these JavaScript riddles. And maybe another link associated with that is I actually did already a talk at the conference where I basically collected some of these riddles and presented them to the people there. And I thought it was a lot of fun. So these are my links.
Awesome. One last thing. Where do people find you online? Do you have a blog or tweet or anything like that?
Yeah, so probably the best place to connect with me online would be via Twitter. So I'm just Dan Shappir on Twitter. That's Shappir with a double P. And I'd love to connect with you. I try to blog, but to be honest, I haven't done it in a while. Just like too busy, I guess. It's one of those things that I know I need to do, but I just don't get around to it. And I do try to attend 2 or 3 conferences a year at least. So if you happen to catch me at a conference, make sure to come up and say hi.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks for coming, Dan. We'll have to have you back on and talk a little bit more about this with the resources and things like that.
Yeah, I'd enjoy that a lot. I think it's a really important topic, and I think it's good things are happening there. The browser manufacturers are doing some awesome stuff, and it's really an interesting topic, I think.
Awesome. Well, thanks for coming and talking to us.
You're welcome. I enjoyed it a lot.
All right. Well, we'll wrap this up, and we will catch everybody next week.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.